Hi, I'm Gabrielle Principe. I'm the education section editor for This View of Life, and I'm here today with Jason Niedermeyer, who's a recent graduate of the School of Education at George Fox University, and he's also a high school teacher. So thanks, Jason, for chatting with me today.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle.
All right. So Jason's piece on This View of Life was invited as the result of a comment that he posted in the education section, and I'm very grateful that he accepted the invitation to write a piece, particularly because many of the folks who are interested in issues of evolution and education perhaps weren't aware of the pervasiveness of evolutionary ideas in Dewey's thinking. So thank you for that. Jason, your article focuses on John Dewey's work, and you characterize him as the first evolutionary philosopher. So before we get into issues of education, could you talk a bit about how evolutionary ideas pervaded Dewey's philosophy and his psychology?
Yeah, so I came across a book as I was kind of initiating my research by Jerome Popp that just the title outright was John Dewey, Evolution's First Philosopher. And I also, in digging through biographies on Dewey, found another one by Thomas Dalton that was looking at Dewey's origins as kind of a naturalist and a philosopher. And both of them kind of got me starting to think along those lines as I was reading some of his seminal works, like Experience in Nature, and then Human Nature and Conduct, ones that seemed to me that would have an evolutionary bent if it was there.
Right.
And so when I started digging into his work, he started making statements about the continuity of life. He wrote an essay about how Charles Darwin would change philosophy forever, and how it would make us have to view everything through an evolutionary lens. And so then as I started really getting into the meat of it, getting into more of his psychological works, like how we think, it's there, it's throughout. And then when I even got into Democracy and Education, at the very end of the book, he probably makes his most bold and straightforward. If you start reading Dewey, you realize that getting him to say anything straightforward is a challenge. He makes this straightforward statement about the continuity of life, and elsewhere he talks about how any animal that's able to make decisions and engage in behaviors has a mind. Now, that doesn't necessarily align with today's theory of mind,
Right.
but he was thinking about that continuity, the fact that humans aren't totally separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, nor even from the rest of all life. He even compares humans to plants in some ways. And so he was definitely thinking that everything's linked, even though at the time he didn't really know what DNA was. He died died really close to the discovery of the structure of DNA. So never really got to see that even come into play.
Right. So clearly Dewey was an evolutionist in his thinking.
Absolutely.
Right. And so you talk about a bit in your piece that despite evolutionary ideas pervading a lot of his thinking and his philosophy and his psychology, he wasn't direct or explicit about evolutionary ideas in his thinking about education. Was, in your view, was that purposeful?
I think it probably was. I know that, again, referring to Jerome Popp in another one of his books, he's a Dewey historian. He says that in 30 years of teaching educational philosophy, he never once heard Darwin brought up. And again, in Democracy and Education, even though Dewey makes this very direct statement about evolution and the continuity of life, he doesn't write anything about how it might inform teaching methods at all. And so in thinking about it, and when he was coming up in the time period, we're talking about Scope's monkey trial,
Right.
in and around the time when he's publishing Democracy and Education. Revamping his thoughts and working hard on, his educational theories. He was probably scared of losing people because the progressive movement was kind of starting to tail off, and he was probably starting to lose influence. And he eventually had to write Experience and Education as kind of a rebuke to how his philosophies had been mischaracterized.
Right.
And so he ended up thinking that evolution, or I think he thought that evolution, if he embedded it, he would have lost people forever.
Right. That makes sense. So talk a little bit about what, in your view, what sorts of evolutionary ideas are central to his thinking about education.
So I think the notion of, he understands the continuity of life. So we're looking at, from an evolutionary perspective, like divergent evolution. So when I was digging into it, I wanted to know, okay, so what is it that, the common characteristics shared between humans and other species like non-human primates,
right.
The way in which they learn, some of that continuity. So I wanted to look at methods. If you can hear the dogs in the background, it's because they're just going attack the lab. I don't know, can you hear them?
Yeah, it's all good though.
I can lock them outside.
All right.
They're about to go out. Okay.
Oh, it's quiet. Good.
Bulldog puppy, she's crazy. But so John Dewey's looking at that notion of what psychological processes aren't unique to humans, and so I wanted to look at, okay, what do we know today about them?
Right.
And I think he also wanted to look at what are the natural transmission methods. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, we can't just focus on, animals with which we share a common, ancestor,
right.
Recent common ancestor. We have to actually think about convergent evolution as well. Like, what are some life histories that we share with organisms? So I looked into things like social carnivores, and the fact that, in many ways we organize our lives in a fashion more similar to social carnivores than non-human primates. And I also look at, the effects of pair bonding and organisms that have strong pair bonds, and then also looked at the kind of hunter-gatherer animals that are constantly dealing with a wide variety of foods, some of which is dangerous to handle or poisonous. And so John Dewey would have been looking for, what are those natural ways of transmitting cultural knowledge? And so in How We Think, that book probably more so than any other really gets after how is it that we come to think and think about thinking. And so I think he kind of stumbled across a lot of those things that evolutionary psychologists and kind of cognitive neuroscientists are looking at, as in the types of knowledge split into kind of the declarative and procedural, and how that affects teaching, as well as concrete abstract, and how those kind of fall in the continuum, and how does knowledge move from concrete to abstract, or from abstract back to concrete. And so he's wrestling with those notions, and how does it get transmitted and solidified in the brain. And it's really fun to look at those cognitive neuroscience works of today, and how he was almost predictive of what the findings would be before even knowing that these sciences would exist.
So that's interesting. So Dewey was a cognitive psychologist before cognitive psychology was a thing.
Exactly. Yes.
That's very cool.
And in fact, he was kind of on the vanguard of the discovery of neuroscience at all, because kind of a mentee of his, Myrtle McGraw, kind of was experimenting with, how experience would affect the way that the brain worked, with some really kind of today arcane ways of determining, brain impulses. And so just seeing, as a child went through certain experiences and then tried to do something like walk, how did that brain act differently than the one of a child, say a twin, that didn't have those same experiences and that was trying to walk?
Very, very cool. Very cool. Well, can you talk a bit about, so if we think about things that go on in a classroom, would you talk a bit about maybe some of the educational practices or pedagogical techniques that that Dewey would have advocated for, or that Dewey did advocate for, that in your view are in line with evolutionary thinking? I mean, in your article, you talk a bit about David Lancey's work and the importance for children to watch and help adults, and how that is something that has an importance in children's learning. You talk a bit about Peter Gray's work and how that's consistent, and his Peter Gray's work on the importance of play, and how that's consistent with evolutionary ideas and maybe Dewey's thinking. So maybe talk just a bit more specifically about maybe what a Dewey classroom would look like that would be in line with a classroom that an evolutionist would also advocate for.
Yeah, so I'll go and start with the Peter Gray, because pervading Dewey's work kind of from the beginning to the end was this notion that play was really important. Mm-hmm. And for him, he kind of talks about, as Dewey always does, which is, kind of ameliorating the false dichotomies, getting rid of them, like realizing that pretty much everything falls in a continuum. And so for him, the notion of play versus work, he makes comments similar to what you'll hear out of Lancey and kind of Lancey's colleagues about that, in kind of non-first world societies, play and work for kids, there's no difference. It's just, I'm doing what the adults are doing. This is awesome. And even if it's, I shouldn't like sweeping, but it's like, this sounds like fun. And so Dewey talks about the fact that, the difference between play and work is the recognition of how soon the payoff comes. The sooner the payoff, if the payoff's immediate, it's going to feel like play. If the payoff, there is kind of a temporal distance there, then it's going to feel more like work. And so for the kid that's mimicking the adult, if they're feeling like they're having immediate success, it's going to feel like play. And when you start as the kid moves kind of to that cognitive space where they're not recognizing the act of sweeping is the end, right. The goal is to get the dirt out of the room. And then it starts feeling more like work. But he's talking about how students that are able to kind of tag along and observe and mimic, they start feeling as if they're contributing, and they're learning because they're observing, which is kind of that classic primate way of learning, right. And they're participating, so they're kind of learning those procedural skills. And so he talks a lot about how, working alongside of adults is critical. When he was talking about in his experimental school at the University of Chicago, how, having those students go through something that feels meaningful, as in, recognizing that, hey, if we want to make something out of metal, we're going to have to heat that metal up and put it in a kiln or put it in some sort of drying apparatus. And so we're going to have to design that drying apparatus. So the kid's obviously not designing from scratch. They're getting instruction from the adult, but they're able to kind of wrestle with it and try out different ideas and see if they work, see if they don't. So we kind of had that embedded inquiry and play and experimentation with the guidance of the adult, which then transitions us kind of into Lancey's work, right. Of having that guided piece. Now, sometimes that guiding, when you start looking at non-humans, in social carnivores, say lions, young individuals learn by tagging along, and they contribute what they can to the hunt. It may just be running behind, or it may be taking up kind of a rear position in kind of the final assault, and they'll slowly move into their positions. And same sort of, whereas a primate, it's more of kind of watching, imitating the adult, trying to do extractive foraging. And so a young orang watching his mom get after a nut of some sort and just trying to imitate that. Same thing with chimpanzees. And so Dewey predicted all this, and he said, this is what I want my classrooms to look like. I want students to tag along with adults. I want adults to model for students. And I want adults to, when the student starts like heading down a path, to move from the teaching role into the learning role and let that student talk through their processes and be engaged with that student and try and think about that student's thinking and possibly even learn from the student, because the student may discover something amazing. And so a Dewey classroom is going to embed all these natural ways of acquiring information and not throw it in the student's face, mm-hmm. and not constantly train, but teach, and probably more importantly, facilitate learning.
So I'm curious, so was Dewey explicit in saying, this is how animals learn? this is how social carnivores learn. That's what we are, so we should learn that way. Was he that explicit?
No, he wasn't, because, if you think about what was, being done,
Right.
I want to say that, and he didn't even know about, like, Vygotsky's work. Even though they were contemporaries of
Right.
each other, Vygotsky's work didn't get out until the 70s
Right.
of Russia.
Right.
And so Vygotsky seemed to be more in tune with what was being done primatologically, and what chimps and the like were able to acquire in terms of knowledge and how they acquired it.
Got it.
Dewey was was such an interdisciplinary thinker. I honestly think sometimes he just went by feeling. He just had this sense that that's what should happen.
Sure.
And evolution was so important to him. He talked about the continuity, and I think he almost thought backwards. Like, this is
Got
how
it.
I think humans learn, and because there's continuity,
Right.
I would imagine that this is similar to how other organisms learn.
Right.
The one thing that he was explicit about was talking about trial and error learning. That was kind of the primary. He didn't use the word heuristic, but I think that's what he would have meant. Kind of that primary modality for learning was trial and error, and then you see that come through in modern evolutionary biologists will focus on primates. We'll talk about the importance of trial and error learning, even within those other modalities of observing and tagging along, is that ultimately it's going to come down to trying something, and did you get a result or did you not, and then learning from that. And so Dewey did heavily emphasize that. And so what I sought to do was, with my dissertation, was try to recognize what is it that Dewey thought, and where was the gap between what is thinking about evolutionary biology being important and kind of pervading all his philosophical thoughts,
Right.
but he kind of built this false wall, which is ironic considering he tried to constantly take down walls between his evolutionary philosophy and his educational theory. And so what I wanted to do was take that wall down and use 100 years worth of relevant research to try to see, okay, how well did his evolutionary philosophy and educational theories, if we put them together, would it be coherent? Would it be as coherent today, or hopefully more coherent today than it was at his time? And I think it is. And I think it can guide us. And I think there's been some good steps made in modern education towards that. It's just funny that it took us 100 years to recognize what this guy was saying we need education.
Well, talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I'm particularly interested in what you do in your classroom, because you're a high school teacher. So, I often hear that it's easier for people who teach younger children to use an evolutionary lens to think about teaching. So it's easy to think about how to make play or trial and error or experimentation or observation central in a preschool classroom or a kindergarten. But how can someone at your level kind of pull that off when you're teaching something that seems as if it's knowledge heavy or information heavy, like biology? So how do you do it? What do you do in your classroom?
So, I think I kind of worked the way that Dewey worked, in that I kind of thought about instinctively what made sense to me. And the experience I had to draw on was from coaching. I was a long time football coach. I actually did college before I did high school, and so in the course of coaching, I was a huge advocate for the kind of whole part whole model. So kind of understanding, okay, this is what we want the defense to look like, and then so we're the defensive line. I was a defensive line coach, and I played linebacker, so I understood a little bit about defensive line, but I kind of had to learn on the fly. And so I had never been trained in defensive line play, so I'd kind of discover it. And so I recognize I didn't feel kind of hamstrung and tied to kind of the old ways of doing things per se. And so I wanted my players, I almost call them students, but neither one the same.
Yeah.
I wanted those guys to understand, okay, what are we trying to get, and then here's how we'll get there. These are the little parts, and I need you to feel your way through them, and then get back to the whole. And I recognize the importance of periodically sprinkling in kind of the go all out, try and incorporate everything, kind of that play, and then we have to get back to that little bit of work.
Right.
So I understood that piece, and then I started recognizing, the context of learning, that just having guys hit a sled was all well and good, but if it was constantly removed from the context of what we were trying to do, they'd lose it. So then when I started getting into teaching in a classroom, I recognized that on the defensive line, the language is these power moves, but in a classroom, the language is language, it's words. And so I started recognizing that, as you're doing stuff that's very knowledge heavy, it's very language heavy, I want that language learned in contexts. So I'm not doing vocab quizzes like, hey, you need to memorize these, because that removes it from all context.
Right.
And so that's why with teaching evolution, I don't saddle students with the word evolution in the front end.
Right.
I don't saddle them with the word natural selection, directional selection, disruptive selection, stabilizing selection. I don't saddle them with that. I kind of have them feel things out, and then we talk about layering in the language, and I might even throw it in there in conversations before I officially assign a definition, and I'll even have students try to come up with definitions before I give them definitions. I also work really hard on analogies within the classroom. I'll present things with analogies, with stories, because I think narrative is the kind of primary mode of thought, of understanding big ideas. I love Gottschall's work. His storytelling animal book was, phenomenal, and, shaped a lot of my thinking about, how is it that we learn? How is it that stories help us, understand the world? So I'll embed a lot of stories, and then try and refine those to really small stories that generate analogies, metaphors for like enzymatic reactions, like how does an enzyme work, what's an inhibitor do, and so I'll analogize that one to say like a car salesman trying to marry car to buyer, and so that salesman's the enzyme, we're trying to bind two substrates together, and and different types of inhibitors that can prevent that car salesman from making that match. And so I think the notion of having these metaphors for thought, if I can give students experiences, those experiences become metaphors for thinking. And then they can start applying those metaphors in different contexts, and then start having new experiences, which then build new metaphors for them, and then layer in the language within that, and hopefully it's just this slow build. So, and in the process, I'm having students have these experiences that are meaningful to them, not just, here are 10 hominid skulls. And here's the names of each of them, and here's what evolutionary biologists think, or paleoanthropologists is what they think. It's, here are 10 skulls. You found them all in the far region of Africa, or whatever, some location. I need you to see if you can't put together kind of a phylogenetic tree of these guys, and you need empirical, and you can use qualitative data in order to justify this. And so then they have to investigate these skulls, so they're looking for like the entry point of the spine, and they're comparing brow ridge sizes, and looking at the sagittal crest and the size of the zygomatic arch, and so they're actually measuring these things and coming up with ways of measuring them. And so they're trying to make sense of it, and some of their trees are really good, and some of them are out like crazy and wouldn't fly, but they're experiencing this, and then later we talk about what each one is, but it's powerful, and they remember handling that skull, and they remember, oh yeah, that one was kind of human-like, but a bigger brow ridge and smaller cranium size, and I think that was the one that started fire, and so they got this Homo erectus in their hands, and so they start remembering it, and it feels more important to them because they messed around with it. They played. They felt like play to them because they had a much more immediate goal, whereas for me it was work because I was wanting them to get to this bigger, more distal understanding of how hominid evolution worked.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, it sounds like you're taking advantage of your students' natural tendencies to want to tell stories or put things into a narrative form to figure things out for themselves, to discover things for themselves without you labeling it, and to make what they're doing meaningful rather than you giving them tasks that are important to do just for a grade and not for fun or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, we try to embed as much research as possible in the class too. So the students actually do some field work, observational field work on animal behavior to to end the year in both my animal behavior and IB biology classes too, so then they even get that feel for, okay, doing it in a lab's one thing, but what's it like when I get out there and
Right.
these are living things that John Dewey would say have their own minds, and how does that work?
Right. Very fun. Very fun. Well, my last question for you is, what do you want your fellow teachers or school administrators to take away from Dewey's work on education on education and evolution?
Ooh, that's a really good question, because there's a lot of answers, I think, to it. But I think that Dewey appreciated that there needed to be, expectations for learning. I think that he got frustrated when his kind of progressive ideas about education got removed from context and meaning, and it just became about a totally student-directed education. And so the idea of pure discovery learning has fallen under a lot of scrutiny and kind of been stigmatized, and I think people assign that to Dewey erroneously. And his Experience in Education book is where he says, look, I definitely want the students' desires, needs, they should be allowed to kind of figure out who is it that they want to be in the world in which they exist. But at the same time, it's the teacher's job to kind of provide a little bit of direction and let them kind of give them some charges, like, hey, let's kind of look at this and hopefully inspire the students to then take up that mantle and charge forward. And then it's the teacher's job to kind of slide to the side and let those students discover this possibly really key concept like natural selection or something to that end. And so often Dewey gets stigmatized that it's discovery, let the student go. No, he wanted there to be some direction from society. He wanted there to be some direction from not just society at large, but that student's local environment. And so he wanted that student to feel what it was like to be a part of this nested community and to kind of find their way in it. So yeah, there was going to be some student direction, but there was also going to be, this societal direction. So I think he would be comforted by the fact that there are some, at least more broad national standards now. He might think there are a few too many, but the fact that there is, okay, so we have this little direction, but now let's trust the teachers to see if they can't come up with ways of letting students discover these important meanings behind these standards on their own terms, like with their own metaphors, using experiences from their own lives to make sense of these ideas. And in order to get there, I think what administrators, both at school level, district level, but national level as well, need to know is that teachers need to be really comfortable with their content. And I think so often teachers aren't afforded enough support to learn their content really deeply. And I think I got lucky. I went to school at a small liberal arts school where I was kind of able to dive deep into research and to some areas of interest. And then the connections I built allowed me to further conduct animal behavior research for several years after. And then I'm just kind of a voracious reader, and that really works for me learning-wise. And so I was able to kind of keep up and constantly build my content knowledge so that makes me more comfortable when teaching it.
Right.
And so I think, providing teachers with time and money and energy to go to conferences and go through, be supported in reading content material and experiencing it. There's some phenomenal programs out there through Columbia University on the East Coast, and then there's the Murdoch Partners in Science program on the West Coast, where high school teachers go and do research with local professors for 2 summers, and then are asked to present their work at
very cool
conferences. And so they get to feel what it's like to be engaged in the field, feel what true inquiry is like, so that when they put their students, they're more inclined to put their students through it. They also know what their students are feeling. And so they're better able to kind of navigate that notion of inquiry, as well as, a contemporary understanding of what's happening with, say, intronic RNA, rather than, ascribing to the, early 90s idea that, so much is junk DNA. Their teacher actually knows what's happening with some of these, microRNAs. And I think that's that's a phenomenal program that I would love to see nationalized. And so, speaking to national administrators, it would be phenomenal if teachers, especially science teachers, got more content level instruction.
Fantastic. Very good. Well, Jason, thanks for taking the time out of your day to chat with us. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.